Hey guys, welcome back. We're reading more of Nancy Drew, The Secret of Shadow Ranch. And we left off, Nancy was chasing the phantom horse. And then some stuff happened and she collided. Two horses collided. One that got out and hers. And she fell off and she blacked out. That's where we stopped. So we're going to start right there. In chapter 13, Missing Artist. When Nancy regained consciousness, Dave was bending over her. "Are you okay?" he asked, anxiously helping her to sit up. "Any bones broken?" "No," said Nancy. "I guess I'm just bruised." "Have I been laying here long?" "Only a few minutes," Dave replied. "I saw you smack into the Palomino and go sailing off. You really reached for the moon." Dave lifted Nancy to her feet and steadied her for a moment. As she thanked him, she could hear horses whinnying and men shouting. "The phantom sure spooked the Palominos," Dave said. "Did you get a good look at it?" Nancy shook her head regretfully. "I didn't get close enough to see how it was rigged." A horseman reined up beside them. It was Walt Sanders. "Fences had been cut," the ranch foreman barked. "We have to round up those Palominos. Could take all night or longer if they run into the hills." He spurred off and Dave turned to Nancy. "Can you make it to the house by yourself?" "Don't worry about me," she assured him. "I'm fine." Dave looked around in the darkness, but there was no sign of Nancy's horse. "I reckon he bolted," he said. His own mount, a seasoned work animal, stood nearby, unaffected by the panic in the meadow. Dave stepped into his saddle. "Keep clear of those running horses," he warned, then rode off after the foreman. By the time Nancy had walked the length of the meadow to the ranch house, she no longer felt shaken from her fall. In the living room were the other three girls and Aunt Bet. On the table, lighted, was an oil lamp which had belonged to the Humbers. As Nancy walked in, Bess cried, "Did you catch the phantom?" "Sorry, no." "Was there any damage this time?" said Miss Raleigh asked. Nancy reported the bad news about the cut fence and the Palominos. Aunt Bet's voice was strained as she said, "If we lose those horses, it'll be a crushing blow for us. I appreciate all you've done, Nancy." "Bess and George told me how you found the letter." "It was so clever of you to deduce what Francis Humber did," Alice said admiringly. "But you didn't finish reading it," George reminded Nancy. Nancy took the letter from her pocket, smoothed out the paper, and held it close to the oil lamp. "George said you left off where he said he had melted down some gold into special pieces." "Yes, here's the place," said Nancy. She read the next sentence. "My treasure is hidden in the oldest dwelling on the ranch." "That's this house," Aunt Bet exclaimed. We were told that Sheriff Humber built it first." "Read on," Bess urged. "Exactly where is the treasure?" Nancy shook her head. "He doesn't say. Listen. I fear that I am followed, and even this note may fall into my enemy's hands. Therefore, I will only say that you know the place I mean." George groaned. "Well, we'll have to search the whole house. We better get started." "There's likely to be a space under a loose floorboard," said Nancy, "or a niche in a chimney flue, or perhaps a false wall in a closet." She suggested that each of them take a section of the house to investigate. Nancy herself went to the big fireplace in the living room. She thought that one of the stones in it might conceal a hiding place. With the aid of her flashlight, the young sleuth tried to peer between the rocks, but they were set close together and no space was visible. She pushed hard on one, but none budged. When she finished, Nancy turned her attention to the Indian grindstone. Because it was set in the middle, she thought there might be something special about it and tried hard to move the stone, but it was as tightly in place as all the others. By the time Nancy had finished checking the living room, the rest of the searchers had straggled back. They reported no success. Baffled, Nancy suggested that they'll go to bed. She felt sore and weary. "Maybe I'll be able to think more clearly after I get some sleep." She gave Valentine's letter to Aunt Bet for safekeeping. At breakfast, Uncle Ed was gray-faced and grim. None of the men had been to bed the night before. "6 Palominos are missing, 2 are wire cut," the rancher reported. Tex snorted. "The metal fence was wrecked, so no good varmint cut it at least 30 places. We've been working on repairs all night. Dave is still out there finishing." Uncle Ed announced that he was driving into Tumbleweed to inform the sheriff of what had happened. "Maybe he can spare me a man and I could get some volunteers to help me round up the horses. We'll have to go up in the mountain and look for them. I also have the telephone company send a man to fix the wire." "What about the water?" Miss Thurman asked. The rancher replied that the pump and the lights, too, would be working in a couple of hours. "The generator was damaged," he said, "but not seriously." "The big mischief was the attack on the horses," Nancy remarked. Whoever planned that wanted to be sure things would be dark and confused, but you could not get help in a hurry. The ranchers quickly finished eating and was rising to go when Dave came in. The Cowboys asked if he could see the Raleighs alone for a few minutes and added, "You come too, Nancy." Uncle Ed led the way into the living room and closed the door. "Now what is it?" he asked. Swiftly, Dave told the couple about his search for the bandit's fortune. "If I do find the treasure," he added earnestly, "I certainly intend to turn over a share to you both." Mr. Raleigh smiled. "Thank you, Dave, but we wouldn't hear of it. I wish you luck." Aunt Bet now told the men about Nancy's discovery of the Valentine letter. Nancy pointed out that surely the treasure was linked to the trouble on the ranch. Until it's found, I'm afraid the Phantom Horse will continue to appear. Uncle Ed agreed. "You're a remarkable sleuth, young lady. Keep up the good work." Dave said that he was with Nancy on the case. He thought they had a good chance to find the treasure, but I won't be able to do much today. We have those palominos to look for. Nancy admitted that she did not know exactly where to search next for the hidden treasure. Aunt Bet patted her shoulder. "You need a holiday from all this trouble. Why don't you girls drive into Phoenix for some fun?" "That's a wonderful idea," said Nancy. As she had thought, her friends were delighted at the prospect. Nancy hurried to get the ranch wagon. When she pulled up in front of the patio, George was waiting with two thermos bottles and a jug of water. As she put them in the back of the ranch wagon, Dave came hurrying past. He grinned. "I'm glad to see that you tenderfoot gals have turned into a water-conscious Westerners." Alice and Bess were approaching the car and heard him. When he was out of earshot, Alice said, "As for you, Nancy, he's really flipped." "And what will poor Ned do?" George teased. Nancy grinned. "Well, be home by the time he gets back from Europe." "Just wait until the square dance tomorrow night," said Bess. "I'll bet Dave's a marvelous dancer." "I wish," said Alice, "that there was somebody to take me." There was a gleam in Bess's eye as she said, "Don't give up hope, Alice. You might meet somebody at the rodeo or barbecue." George looked at her cousin quizzically, and Nancy smiled. Both knew Bess loved playing the role of matchmaker. "What have you got up your sleeve?" George demanded. "Just my arm," replied Bess. But she grinned. Nancy spoke up. "Let's do some shopping in Phoenix. I would like to find something special to wear tomorrow." "I know," exclaimed Bess. "Let's all buy Indian costumes." When they reached the city, George directed Nancy to a shop which sold a variety of Indian apparel and souvenirs. The sight of the colorful squaw dresses drove all the thoughts of the ranch trouble from the girls' minds. Happily, they tried them on and helped one another make selections. Alice was delighted and pirouetted in front of the long mirror to watch the wide skirt swing out. Finally, Nancy chose a turquoise blue model with silver rickrack trimming. George chose a bold red, which set off her short dark hair, and Bess selected one of the yellow skirts and black bodice. Alice picked out a pumpkin-colored costume trimmed in black. With their purchases in boxes, the girls strolled down the street to a Spanish restaurant. Here, they ate a delicious lunch of tacos and spicy chili. For dessert, they had iced fresh fruit. But Bess sighed, "That was super." Afterwards, they walked to a wide street beside a park where an outdoor painting exhibition was being held. The group stopped now and then to admire and compliment the artists who sat beside their works. As the girls lingered over a painting, Nancy wandered ahead and then stopped before a lone picture. After a casual glance, she suddenly realized it was a pastel drawing of the old hotel in the ghost town on Shadow Mountain. Quickly, she called her friends. "That's the same hotel, all right," George declared. "That's the one we were hitched our horses and found that crushed crayon." Alice was pale. "My father did that pastel. I know it." The artist's chair beside the picture was vacant. "I must find him," Alice cried out. Okay, so that one was called The Missing Artist. Did they find the artist? Not really. But they did find another picture from Alice's dad, who's the artist that there's in question. But the chair next to it was empty. So they have a clue that they think the treasure's in the house. Dave finally told why he's really there, and they think they might be on to where the artist is. That's a lot in that little short chapter. But why wait? Let's just go on to the next chapter, right? The nettle trick. Near the empty artist's chair, a man sat sketching. Nancy walked towards him. "Pardon me, but do you know where the person who drew that pastel?" The man looked up from his work and pointed with his pencil. "There's the one." Nancy turned and saw a stout woman in a blue dress coming towards them. Want to buy that pastel, girls? It's the last one. The rest sold like hotcakes. Alice's face showed keen disappointment. This isn't your work. The woman chuckled and sat down heavily. That's right, dearie. I can't even draw a cow. I'm a dealer. I buy from the artists and sell their work. Where's the man who did this picture? Nancy pressed. That I don't know. He told me he was a stranger just visiting Phoenix. Seemed kind of closed-mouthed. Didn't say where he came from and where he was staying. Alice asked, was he a slender, gray-haired man? Yes. Said his name was Bercy. Do you know him? We think so, Nancy replied. Alice looked longingly at the picture. How much is it? She asked the woman. When Alice heard the price, her face clouded. I haven't enough money to buy it. Exchanging quick glances, the other girls reached an agreement. That's all right, Alice, said Nancy. We'll make up the difference. When the picture was paid for, Alice took it gratefully. She thanked the girls as they walked away from the dealer, then added, Oh, Nancy, you've been so wonderful to me. Alice's eyes were misty with emotion. I feel that we must be getting closer to my father. She thought that he might have returned to the mountain cabin and begged Nancy to go back with her. I wish I could, said Nancy, but it would be too late to make the trip today, and after we reach the ranch, tell you what, though, I'll take you in the morning. George had another idea. There's just a chance our Uncle Ross Rigger might be around this exhibition someplace. He might have come to see how his pictures were selling. The others agreed that George had a point, and for a while the four girls strolled through the park, keeping their eyes open for the slender gray-haired man. They did not see him. Near mid-afternoon, Nancy treated everyone to cool soda and a passing vendor, and they sat on a bench to drink them. Bess glanced at her watch and suggested they start for home. George drove. They crossed the desert without trouble and arrived at the ranch in time for supper. At the table, they learned that the telephone, lights, and water had been restored, but 4 of the Palominos were still missing. These critters are up on Shadow Mountain somewhere, Bud remarked gloomily as he passed a biscuit to Nancy. We have our work cut out to track them. And we might as well face it, said Uncle Ed. They might be badly hurt. To lighten the conversation, Aunt Bet reminded everyone of the barbecue the next day. It's customary for us ranch folk to take a dessert. Any suggestions? Tex grinned. I sure do cotton to chocolate cake. Nancy makes a scrumptious one, said Bess. Then I guess she's elected, Miss Raleigh said with a smile. Nancy laughed. Thank you for the job, my friends. Now, who's going to help? I will, chorused Dave, Tex, and Bud. Good, said Nancy. You boys can shell the walnuts for topping the icing. That is, if you have any, Miss Thurman. We have plenty of everything, the cook declared. Just step right up and take hold. Well, I'll help, Bess said happily. Let's make it extra big cake. After supper, the girls dried the dishes for Miss Thurman. Then Nancy put all the cake ingredients on the big kitchen table. The cook gave her several large bowls. Tex grinned as he picked up a nutcracker. Boy, we hired out to punch cows. Here we are peeling nuts. While Nancy and her assistants worked, they talked about the phantom. Miss Thurman listened intently. Where do you think the ghost horse is kept? Alice asked. Folks say Valentine had a hideaway on Shadow Mountain, Miss Thurman spoke up, and I figure that's where the critter stays now, same as it did in life. The girl tried to convince the cook that the apparition was a mere trick, but they could not do it. Nancy changed the subject. If Valentine's did have a hideout in this area, very likely he kept his horse in a corral there. It's possible that the person who are attacking the ranch have discovered the place and are using it for their trick horse. Miss Thurman shook her head gloomily. If it was real folks doing the damage, I'd face right up to them, she declared. But I've seen that spook with my own eyes. I tell you, it's too much for my nerves. By the time the baking was finished, Miss Thurman had excused herself and gone to bed. Now for the icing, said Nancy. When the cake was cool enough, she covered it with a thick, creamy swirl and dark chocolate, and studded the top with whole walnuts. Bess sighed. It's too bad we can't have just a tiny piece now, isn't it? I sure could go for a slab, Tex agreed hungrily. Come on, Cookie, Dave coaxed Nancy. Think how good that would taste to us poor writers on that midnight watch, Bud said with a soft drawl. Saddle sore, weary. You're breaking our hearts, George said cheerfully. Graham cracker and milk tonight, Nancy announced with a chuckle. You'll get your cake tomorrow. In the morning, Alice could hardly contain her excitement over the trip to the cabin. Now wanting their destination known, Nancy had warned Alice to say nothing of her hopes at breakfast table. When Aunt Beth asked the girls about their plans, Nancy said Alice and I would like to go for a ride in the mountains. George had a letter to write, and Beth said she wanted to wash and set her hair. I'll saddle it up for you, Shorty had volunteered. Nancy was surprised at his friendly gesture. She and Alice thanked him and then hurried to change into riding clothes. When they were dressed and waiting on the portico, Tex walked up leading Nancy's bay. Just behind him came Shorty with a sorrel for Alice. Nancy stepped into the yard and mounted easily. With a shrill whinny, the horse reared. Hang on, Tex shouted. Nancy gripped the pommel tight and hung onto the reins. The horse pitched high and landed stiff-legged on all fours. Tex seized the bridle and held the bay down, giving Nancy time to fling herself from the saddle. Hey, boy, easy now, Tex said as he tried to calm the excited animal. Nancy, are you hurt? Alice asked worriedly. I'm all right, Nancy replied breathlessly, but what's the matter with the horse? Shorty had hurried to Tex's assistant, and now the snorting steed was standing still. The redhead cowboy's eyes narrowed with suspicion as he loosened the saddle girth and reached up under the blanket. I thought so. He brought out his hand and held it open for others to see. In his palm lay a nettle. Shorty's eyes grew wide. Well, what do you know about that? He drawled. Tex looked at him levelly. What do you know about this? Me, exclaimed Shorty. Some mean coyote pulled that trick, not me. You saddled the animals, Tex retorted and turned to Nancy. I was passing the stables when Shorty came out with these mounts. He asked me to bring this one over to you. Now, hold on there a minute, Shorty put in. When I went to the stable after breakfast, I found this bay already saddled. I threw the saddle on the other one and brought them out. That's all I know about it. You got no call to accuse me. No, sir, not me. Tex's face flashed with anger. If you're telling the truth, Shorty Steele, I apologize. Before the stocky cowboy could answer, Nancy suggested that Tex checks Alice's saddlebag. He did and reported that it was all right. The girls mounted and rode towards the meadow. I don't believe Shorty was telling the truth, said Alice. Nancy said nothing. But she was inclined to agree aloud, and she said someone had not given up trying to get me out of the picture. When they finally sighted the cabin, Nancy reined up behind a clump of big boulders. She swung from the saddle and ground, hitched her horse, but was not quick as Alice. The younger girl dashed to the cabin and knocked on the door. As Nancy ran up, it was opened by a slender, gray-haired man. With a shock, Nancy recognized him. He was the one who had put the snake's rattle into her knitting bag and dropped the warning note into her car. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. So they finally found the gray-haired man, who also might be, we don't know, Alice's dad, the missing artist. But before they got there, somebody tried to hurt Nancy again by putting what they call a nettle, so it's like a little sharp thing, under this horse's saddle, so when she sat on it, it would hurt the horse and he would rear up and throw her off. It didn't work though. So, should we see what happens? Who this gray-haired man is? Is it Alice's dad? Is it someone else? Let's find out. Chapter 15. A Perilous Ride. Alice was on the verge of tears. The man in the cabin doorway was not her father. He scowled at the two girls. What do you want? Nancy was sure the man must have recognized her, but he gave no sign of it, so she pretended not to know him. Quickly, she brought up an excuse for coming. Are you Mr. Bursey? She asked. Yes, why? We'd like to buy one of your pastels, Nancy replied. My what? Pastels, your pictures, Nancy said. Oh, the man paused. I haven't any more. How did you know I was here? Nancy explained casually that Mary Dear had told him that the artist lived on the mountain. Several days ago, we happened to see this cabin, and we thought perhaps it might be where you live. He gave Nancy a long, hard look. My paintings are all gone, he said. No use coming back. Nancy apologized for bothering him, and as the girls turned to walk back to their horses, he closed the door. Alice was deeply upset. I just can't believe that man drew those pictures. I'm sure he didn't, Nancy replied as the girls mounted. He's no artist. He didn't know what I meant by pastels, and he called the pictures paintings. He should have known they were drawings made with special crayons. She told Alice how she, Bess, and George had encountered the man before. Alice was excited. Maybe he's holding my father prisoner somewhere. Nancy agreed that was possible, but where? She wondered. There had been no one else in the one-room cabin. Recalling how Chief had appeared mysteriously from behind it, Nancy surmised what was a hiding place nearby. "What shall we do, Nancy?" Alice asked. "Report to the sheriff as fast as we can." Nancy added that if Alice's father was a prisoner of Bercy, the gray-haired man, and his pals might be very well to be the Chicago bank robbers. And since Bercy is also mixed up with the ranch trouble, his gang is probably responsible for the phantom horse. As the girls rode down the trail, Nancy's thoughts dwelt uneasily on the man who said his name was Bercy. Could he possibly believe that she had not known him? "I'm afraid my trumped-up story didn't fool him," she decided. "He must know I'll report him to Sheriff Curtis, but why didn't he try to stop me?" The answer was plain. The man believed that people knew the girl's destination. He doesn't want us to disappear at his cabin, Nancy told herself, so he'll arrange an accident for us on the way down the mountain. She turned in her saddle and warned Alice to keep alert for signs of pursuit. A little further along, they came to a fork in the trail. "Let's follow this other path," Nancy suggested. They soon found the new route as a hazardous one. However, we were forced to slow down. The horses were picking their footing on a narrow trail which wound back and forth across the sheer cliff. Alice glanced up. "Uncle Ed says the Westerners call this kind of path an eyebrow trail." "I can kind of see why." A few minutes later, the girls rode under a rock overhang which prevented them from seeing the turn of the path above them. Suddenly, pebbles and dust started falling from above. Someone was following them. Nancy signaled to Alice, who nodded her understanding. The rider sat in his intense silence as their horses slowly receded to the bottom of the cliff, where the trail became less steep, but was narrow and precarious. The girls urged their horses to go as fast as they dared. Soon they heard the clatter of a horse's hooves behind them. Nancy knew that he had no defense against the surprise attack she feared was coming. It would take only a few boulders rolling from above to spook the horse and cause the accident. Nancy looked ahead for shelter. Some distance below, the trail disappeared among high rocks. If we can reach that spot before our enemy strikes, she thought, we may have a chance. Again, the girls urged their mounts on and rode desperately towards the screen of rocks. Jolting hard, Alice clung to the saddle horn all the way. "We made it," she gasped as she rounded a corner and were hidden between the huge boulders which lay on either side. Swiftly, Nancy dismounted, signaling her companion to do the same. The younger girl followed as Nancy led her horse into a cluster of the giant rocks. Alice held her mount firmly and kept one hand soothingly upon its nose. It was only the animal would stand quietly. One jangle of the bridle or hoof scuffing on a stone, and the hiding place would be revealed. Hardly breathing, the girls heard the clatter of stones as their pursuer approached. The sounds came closer, then suddenly stopped. He sees we're not on the trail ahead, Nancy thought. Would the rider figure that they had rounded the next curve but were hiding? For a long moment there was silence from the other side of the boulders. He's listening, Nancy thought. The girls stood frozen. Then came the creak of the saddle and the sound of hooves as the rider moved on. Nancy and Alice gave a sigh of relief. After a few minutes, led their horses out of the boulders. Quickly, the two remounted. Alice said fearfully, "When he reaches open mountainside again, he'll see that he missed us and come back. We'll meet him head on." "I know," Nancy replied. "We must look for another branching trail." Presently, she spotted a side path along the boulder, and the girls guided their horses onto it. The way downward was narrow and rough, and the two riders were sheltered first by rocks, then tall fir and tamarack trees. They reached the valley a mile from the other trail and came down. "We made it safely," Alice cried in relief. "Oh, Nancy, how can I ever thank you?" Her companion smiled. "Don't think I wasn't scared myself." It was noon when the girls dismounted at the stable. They hurried to the living room where they found the Raleighs chatting with Bess and George. While Alice excitedly reported all that had happened to them, Nancy telephoned the sheriff. She told him his suspicions of the man calling himself Bercy, and also the possibility that Ross Rigger, Alice's father, was being held prisoner on the mountain by some gang responsible for the phantom horse trick. Sheriff Curtis said, "I'll go up to the cabin at once with 2 men and arrest this hombre Bercy and his confederates." Nancy hastened back to the living room and reported the conversation. "That's great," exclaimed George. "If the sheriff catches the bank robbers, it will mean the end of the damage on the ranch." but they must have hit another hideout where they keep Uncle Ross. Bess objected, and we don't know where that is. Besides, the sheriff may find only Bercy. But if he talks, we'll get to the bottom of the mystery, Nancy reminded her. Suddenly, the door of the portico burst open, and Dave came in. Mr. Raleigh, we found the missing horses. Amid the girls' exclamations of joy, the rancher beamed and asked, where are they? Tex, Bud, and I put them in the meadow. We found them up on Shadow Ranch grazing by a creek, Dave hesitated. The only thing is, they're hurt. Mr. Raleigh's jaw tightened. Bad? 3 of them are wire cut, and the mare is limping. We better call the vet. The rancher agreed, and Dave hurried to the telephone. Could be worse, Uncle Ed said. Maybe everything will be all right, provided there's no more damage. Aunt Bet smiled carefully. Nothing more is likely to happen. After all, the sheriff is on his way to round up the gang, thanks to Nancy. In a happy frame of mind, the girls hurried away to dress in their squaw outfits before lunch. While they showered, Nancy's thoughts were on the treasure. Where she could the outlaw have hidden it. Still puzzling, Nancy slipped into her blue costume. She brushed her titanium hair until it gleamed, then put on a pair of small silver earrings and added a touch of lipstick. The other girls were not ready yet, so Nancy went into the living room to wait for them. As she seated herself in one of the rockers, her glance fell on the fireplace. Once again, the Indian grinding stone caught her attention. She recalled what Aunt Bet had told her about it and about the other stones. Suddenly her eyes lit up with an idea, and she jumped forward in excitement. Bess, George, Alice, she called, running to the door. What is it? Asked George as the 3 girls came hurrying down the hall. Nancy's eyes sparkled with excitement. I think I know where the treasure is. That's an interesting place to stop that one, isn't it? So Nancy thinks... So they found out that it wasn't Alice's dad. We learned that part. We also had a really bad trip down that mountain, but they got back safe, called the cops, the sheriff. The sheriff's going to go arrest Bercy. And then Nancy saw the Indian grindstone. Now she knows where the treasure is. She thinks she knows where the treasure is. All right, we're going to do one more chapter. It's an extra long video compared to others, but I wanted to get 4 chapters done so I don't have to do 3. No, I have one more video to do. All right, chapter 16, The Sheriff's Quarry. A burst of excited questions met Nancy's announcement. She chuckled and George said, Quiet, everybody. Now tell us where the treasure is. Nancy led her friends into the living room, shut the door, and announced, It's in the cliff houses down the valley. They're certainly the oldest dwellings around here, said George, but they're not on the ranch. They were when Valentine wrote his letter. Nancy, how do you know? Alice asked. Because Aunt Bet told us that every stone in this fireplace came from somewhere on the ranch. It stands to reason that the Indian grinding stone came from the cliff dwellings. She reminded the girls that Sheriff Umber had been obliged to sell that part of his property after Valentine's death. It's natural that he would get rid of the outlying section first. Nancy, declared George, that's a great piece of deduction. Just then, the triangle clanged for luncheon. As the girls hurried to the kitchen, Nancy requested them keep her theory a secret. We won't be able to check it before tomorrow, and we don't want anybody else to get there before us. As the group hurried into the kitchen, they stared in amazement. Miss Thurman, ladling out stew at the stove, was wearing her big white apron as usual, but on her head was perched a black straw hat bedecked with artificial roses. Instead of being amused, the cowboys stood about looking uncomfortable, and Aunt Bet's face was strange. I'm leaving, announced the cook without turning from her work. I have fixed my last dinner in this place. As soon as this is over, I'm riding into Tumbleweed with you young folks, taking the 3 o'clock bus for Phoenix. Mr. Raleigh said soothingly, Things have been pretty rough around here, Miss Thurman, but we think they'll be getting better pretty soon. Miss Thurman faced the rancher squarely. Mr. Raleigh, I can take rough times with the best of them, but phantom horses, that's too much for me. She picked up the big bowl of stew and walked towards the table. Aunt Bet followed her, pleading, Miss Thurman, please reconsider. Nope, said the woman, and set the bowl down with a thump. Nancy knew that the loss of a cook would be an added hardship for Aunt Bet, who not only had ranch house duties, but also needed to help her husband. This new crisis threw a pall over the meal. At the appearance of the magnificent lemon meringue pie, the gloom became even deeper, for it seemed to be the last time any of the diners would taste Miss Thurman's fine baking. When the dessert was gone, the men pushed back their chairs and rose. Immediately the cook asked Dave what time he would be driving the ranch wagon to Tumbleweed. Before he could answer, Nancy spoke up. Not for a half hour yet, are you, Dave? He caught the urgent message in her eyes and nodded. I'll honk the horn when I'm ready to go, he promised. As soon as the men had left the kitchen, the girls and Aunt Bet gathered around Miss Thurman and pleaded with her to remain. The little woman shook her head and regretfully but steadfastly refused. The Phantom has scared me out of my skin, she declared. If I could prove to you that the Phantom is a real horse, Miss Thurman, Nancy asked, would you stay? Of course I would. I'm not afraid of a live critter. Then just let me have a little time. I feel sure I'll be able to show you how the trick is done. The others chimed in, cajoling the cook to give Nancy a chance. Bess added, I don't know how well we'll get along without you and all those wonderful pies. Miss Thurman considered a moment. All right, one more night. At their delighted thanks, she flushed with pleasure and marched off to remove her hat. When she returned, the girls and Aunt Bet helped her clear the table. Before long, the horn of the ranch wagon sounded, and Nancy left with her friends. Dave, Tex, and Bud were in the yard talking to Uncle Ed. Bud was holding a guitar in a case, and short distance away, Shorty lounged against a horse trailer where he had hitched to the back of the ranch wagon. As the girls came up, they heard Uncle Ed say, You go ahead, boys, and have a good time. You earned a holiday. You might need to help with those palominos when the vet comes, said Dave. He glanced uneasily at Nancy, and she understood at once how he felt. I'll be glad to excuse you, Dave, if you feel you ought to stay, she said. No, that's not necessary, Ed Raleigh said. As Dave thanked him, Nancy noticed Tex talking quietly to Alice. Flushed with excitement, she smiled happily and hurried to Nancy's side. Tex's brother, Jack, is going to be in the rodeo, and Tex says Jack would like to take me to the barbecue and dance. He's 15. Jack, I mean. Is it all right, Uncle Ed? She asked, blushing. The rancher nodded and chuckled. I've met the young man. Go ahead. As Alice went back to tell Tex, Nancy, and George, looked knowingly at Aunt Bess, who dimpled. Now, how did you fix that, Miss Cupid? Her cousin asked. It was easy, Bess replied. I remember Tex had mentioned his brother was coming into Tumbleweed for the rodeo. Come on, called Tex. Let's roll. The others hastened to the ranch wagon. Bud, carrying his guitar, climbed in the back of the wagon, and Shorty joined him. Tex, George, and Bess sat in the middle, while Nancy and Alice took seats next to Dave, who was at the wheel. I've never been to a rodeo, Alice said as they started up. What's it like? Tex grinned. Well, Dave here is going to flip some fancy loops, and so is Bud. He means they're going to rope a cow, said Bess. Steers, Tex corrected. Bess asked Tex what he was going to do. Dog a steer was his reply. Dave chuckled at Alice's puzzled look. He'll ride a horse alongside a running steer and leap aboard. Then he'll bite the dust, Bud teased. Not Tex, Dave rejoined. He's a real salty bulldogger. And Shorty there, he's a bronco buster, Tex added. And I'm fixing to win, too, Shorty declared. Wouldn't be the first time, he went on to brag about several occasions when he had won prizes in the rodeo. While he talked, Nancy was quiet, thinking about the phantom horse. Oh, how I wish Chief could talk, she said to herself. He's been closer to it than anyone. She wondered again why the dog had been held prisoner. Suddenly, Nancy thought of the light she had seen in the spring house shortly before the ghost horse had appeared. With a thrill of excitement, Nancy suddenly figured out how the trick could have been done. It was all she could do to keep from exclaiming aloud. She decided to say nothing to the other girls until she had an opportunity to prove her theory. And I can't do that until after dark, she thought. When they reached Tumbleweed, Dave drove slowly through the streets, covered with visitors. Many of them had on fringed buckskin jackets, and some of the women wore long pioneer dresses with sunbonnets. Others wore graceful squaw dresses. Suddenly, Nancy spotted a drably dressed, gray-haired man standing in the doorway of a store. The man, who called himself Bercy. At that moment, his eyes met hers, and he darted away in the crowd. Nancy's heart sank. The sheriff, who was on his way to or from the cabin, had missed his quarry. Nancy wondered what to do. Get word to the authorities? Dave interrupted her thought by saying the rodeo would not start for an hour. We have to go and check in, he said. What do you girls want to do in the meantime? Oh, we'll keep busy, Nancy replied. When the cowboy had left, she suggested that Bess take Alice and hunt for Bercy. She and George would go in another direction. Let's meet at Mary Dear's shop. They all arrived half an hour later. There had been no trace of the man. He probably left town in a hurry, George deduced. The store was crowded, and Mary Dear had an assistant working behind the counter. While the other girls looked at jewelry, Nancy beckoned her Indian friend aside and asked if she could keep a secret. When Mary promised, Nancy told her that she had hoped to find the treasure in the cliff dwellings and inquired the best way to get to them. There are stairs up the front, said Mary, but they're not safe. You had best come down from above. She exclaimed that at the far end of the cliff apartments there was a huge slab of rock which had been used as a lookout point by the ancient Indians. Stairs led from the rock down to the top row of dwellings. Nancy thanked Mary and promised to let her know if she discovered anything. By this time, the other girls had bought Indian jewelry, and after Nancy had purchased a turquoise pillbox for Hannah, they left the shop. The foursome followed the arrows to the far end of town, where they found the rodeo arena and a short distance from the stockyard. Nancy bought tickets at the front gate, and they all found seats in the stands. Bess sighed, I'm so hot. I'd like to have a cold drink. I think I need a hot dog to go with it. George grinned. Eating is really very fattening hobby, dear cousin. Before Bess could retort, a voice came from the loudspeaker. Telephone call from Miss Nancy Drew in the booth next to the refreshment stand. The girls looked at another in amazement, afraid that something had gone wrong at the ranch. Nancy excused herself and hurried off. She made her way through the crowd to the first telephone booth beside the hot dog stand. As she reached it, the door opened, and Bercy stepped out with a grin. At the same moment, a tall figure in black glided to her side. Mr. Diamond. Bercy's strong finger closed on Nancy's wrist. You're coming with us, he growled, and don't yell, or you'll be sorry. All right, Nancy once again is in trouble as we close off this video. So she's got Mr. Bercy and Mr. Diamond have her. She thinks she knows where the treasure is in the Indian dwellings. And she thinks she knows how the Phantom Horse trick is happening. So we will continue, I think, for our last video. Next video, sorry. We'll have our last video, then the next one. We'll finish this book. So until then, see you guys.